When we think about this, we think about it as a series. So this issue investigation is part four in our series of data centers in coastal Georgia, looking at things from siting and scale to local impacts to what about the resources that are needed for data centers, looking at today specifically, what about the impacts on humans, the quality of life impacts. And so we're going to look through kind of some of the things we've covered already, but we're going to do a deeper dive on some of the case studies and stories that are happening here in the US specifically, and then specifically in the state of Georgia. Again, there is not as many here on the coast, and we fingers crossed like it that way. So let's move forward with the meat and potatoes of things. I'm gonna jump into this. I think we will get live streaming sorted momentarily, but I want to make sure that we get all of our content covered. So I'm gonna jump to the next slide, which is our agenda for today. So welcome. Welcome to a presentation about data centers in coastal Georgia, presented by us, OHM. I'm going to introduce OHM. I'm going to introduce our presenters for today. Um, we're going to talk about kind of the uniqueness of coastal Georgia, some of the ecological impacts that we've been mentioning in our lead up to this specific um, issue investigation. We're going to talk about some case studies that I mentioned before. We'll talk about some actions that can be taken, some resources that can inform those actions. And then again, we're going to end with the Q&A, and we'll leave a good chunk of time for Q&A. I know there's lots of questions out there in the world. So thank you for joining us. Um, for introduction's sake, I'm Eric Swanson. I'm the Advocacy Education Coordinator. My job is to connect people to the issues that they're facing in coastal Georgia and provide them resources. Those resources then allow us to help elevate people's voices, help people to become educated about threats to their environment, and help to aid us in the goal of protecting the Georgia coast. I'm going to be joined with my colleague. I'm going to let her introduce herself. I think she just has to jump off mute. There she is. And that slide should advance. There we go. Awesome.
Hi, I'm Hannah Salvaggio. I'm our coastal planning strategist here at 100 Miles. So I work coastwide, helping our geographically based advocates, like the South Coast and Mid Coast, North Coast advocates, on planning issues and land use issues in their regions.
Thank you, Hannah. And who is 100 Miles? So 100 Miles is a organization. It's led by a dedicated staff of 16 and a committed board of directors. We work to help residents and visitors to our coasts better understand the critical issues that are happening here right now. We wear lots of hats, we like to say. We're advocates, organizers, educators, community planners, naturalists, strategists, but above all, we are conservationists. We care about the land and the places we live and call home. Um, we're working towards a really bold vision. We're going to create a future where our coast has thriving communities, protected landscapes, and secure wildlife. And we do this kind of with a three-pronged approach. We have this commitment to community engagement, to advocacy, and to education. And those are the ways that we protect 100 miles coast forever. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a member if you're a member. If you want to learn more, you can always reach out to learn more about what we do as an organization. Webinar schedule so far has been kind of in the heat of the summer, and we've been talking about all those things I mentioned before, site and scale, ecological and resource impacts. What can my community do? We talked to our advocates during that webinar. And then today we're going to talk about quality of life impacts. All of these three and This fourth one will be a hyperlink to the recorded version as well. So if you run across this slide and you want to view them in the future, just feel free to click through there. It'll take you to our YouTube where all our videos are stored. So like to think of this one as quality of life impacts on coastal Georgia, but also kind of a wrap up of this data center issue investigation series. So if you have questions about any of these, please you can save them to then, and we'll be happy to answer them as best as we can. Um, if you are joining us via Facebook Live or a live stream function, you can watch our webinars here. That'll allow you to be registered, and that'll be allowing you to get the links that I've mentioned already. So if you're not registered, please do register. Then I have your email, and then I can get you those links with all those resources and the recordings. So we're going to start from the beginning. What are data centers? The World Resource Institute defines data centers as the physical infrastructure of the internet. They house the servers, network equipment, and supporting systems such as cooling, power backup, fire suppression, and security that keep digital services running readily. And so, what does that mean? They're basically big warehouses that store information on network servers. They are used to hold the data that make up the cloud, and these computers themselves and the hardware inside of them have to be kept in specific conditions to remain functional. And that's a little bit about kind of where those resource concerns come from. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. We talked in our first webinar about siting vulnerabilities, about how in coastal Georgia we have this very unique ecological system that we're in, but also that we have these abiotic forces that are really affecting us, all these possibilities of hurricanes and flooding. The dynamicness of the Georgia coast is really, really, really important part to take into account when thinking about data centers here. Um, Heat is also a big one. As part of the South, we have heat and humidity, and the climate of South Georgia maybe requires a little bit more cooling than other places in the U.S. might. And then saltwater exposure as well. So if you are close to the coast, you have saltwater exposure that happens to equipment that is digital equipment can easily break down when exposed to salt water. So if you're very close to the coast, that is always a concern as well, including saltwater intrusion that can happen during a large flooding events. So siting is something that we discussed in depth in that first webinar. Hannah was a great expert to have on that, and it's great to go back and watch. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask them as well. We also talked about how right now there is no data centers in coastal Georgia. There's maybe plans for some, but there's no current data centers. We have a large concentration in the Atlanta metro area. We have some more throughout the Piedmont. But as far as the coastal plain of Georgia, we really don't have any. The closest one to us being Athens and being a very small data center in Athens. The World Resource Institute actually has this really wonderful map, and the size of the circle correlates to the size of the energy consumption of that data center. So the amount of gigawatts or megawatts that data center consumes. Um, what we talked about in our second webinar were the ecological concerns. And so we highlighted that data centers create heat islands, that they have large footprints with impervious surfaces, which increase runoff and flooding concerns. They require designated transmission line that increase habitat fragmentation. They produce noise pollution. They require redundancies that often mean large digital generators as backup, creating localized air quality concerns. These were ecological concerns because they affect the wildlife and the land where these data centers exist. But ecological concerns also have human impacts as well. So that's what we're going to look at today is kind of the human side of these more wildlife impacts that we like to talk about. There's a thing that we do a lot when we're talking about conservation where we draw a line between animal impacts, environment impacts, and humans. And sometimes that line is not a good thing because it removes us from the wildlife that surrounds us. And that's important to draw a distinction between us being tied directly to that environment as well. The other thing we talked about in webinar 3 was what's going on in our coastal counties. So this is a little bit of a map about kind of what's going on our coast. As most of you may know, there are data center ordinances out there for many of our coastal counties. Many of them do not have ordinances. There are planned data centers to some differing degrees throughout our coast. And we have dedicated coastal advocates working in the North Coast, the South Coast, and the Mid Coast on data centers and trying to figure out the best way to move forward with the communities on what their needs are in regard to data centers and specifically their ordinances that they have on the books in those counties. I won't go more into depth here. I do want you to always know that our coastal advocates' job is to be in the community. It's to be answering questions, and they are a resource to you. And I have their contact information and can connect them with you if you have any concerns. So please do reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end, and you received an email from me as well. So please do reach out if you have any specific concerns for your county or city as a coastal resident. And then the fourth one, we're going to just basically talk about human impacts, the impacts on your quality of life. And so it's important to start out by saying what data center need. And I think this is a kind of a silly slide, but it really does break down the idea that a data center needs land, it needs power, and it needs water. Um, I think the things that is important to remember is that right now, data centers don't really need money. There are many, many investors out there that are interested in working with data centers to fund them. Data centers do need money, but it's not hard to find, I guess is a good way of saying it. What can be hard to find is the land, power, and water, and that's where the siting and scale comes in. And I wanted to lay that groundwork before we move forward with this because when we think about a look at kind of data centers in general, we have to remember that land, power, and water are the three things that are points at which communities that a data center is proposed in can engage in and where they can find ways of determining where that is coming from and then learn about the process and engage in the process of how that data center was permitted. So, data centers promise local investments in education. They promise job creation. They often promise tax relief. They promise increasing economic growth, and they promise infrastructure improvements. I think it's important to note that these promises are oftentimes just that. They are things that are said on paper. Whether there is follow through is not a necessary, not necessarily a known entity when they set out those promises. Many of these are said, and the follow through is on the company to do. And so when we think about a promise, we think of it as just that. We need those to be part of a community benefits agreement, part of the local ordinances codified in some way so that these promises aren't just promises. And so we talked a lot about that in our last webinar about data center promises and what a community benefit agreement looks like and how that can be helpful to your community and moving forward if a data center is proposed. So this is where I'm going to talk about all the recent articles that we've been reading. Most of these articles that are on this page about what data centers deliver are from within at least the last 3 months. So many of them are, June, July, May, June, July. Some of them are earlier in 2026, but all of these things are happening right now. Data centers is this huge topic that everyone's talking about, and that's because it is a very much a growing um, market. It's a growing economy. It's a place where people are seeing a place for growing wealth, for speculating on whether or not they can have the best model for a data center, get that out there, and use it to be part of this digital infrastructure economy. Um, it's important to note that most of this growth is for AI data centers or possibly in the past crypto mining. All of these things are used. Data centers are used and have been used for years and years and years and years and years. They are growing now because of the intense demands that AI models have for that data center storage that is necessary. So. We're going to jump in and talk about these specific articles, but this is what we like to think about as data centers delivering when it comes to um, how they come into communities. So OpenAI is basically built out Stargate 1. It's their flagship data center in Abilene, Texas. This large data center has an on-site natural gas power plant that actually feeds energy to it. So it's slightly different than some other data centers. But it is been in the news because it's caused housing scarcity in and around Abilene, Texas, which has led to an increase in monthly rent by up to $1,000. And all of these links down here are clickable to follow that news article. We want to remind people that when we think about data centers, we often think about finding the best uh, case study to compare what is happening in one location to maybe what may be proposed in our location. And so OpenAI's Stargate 1 is a group of proposed data centers, this being the flagship one, the one that's most built out. Stargate 1, Stargate 2, Stargate 3, Stargate 4 all have locations throughout the United States, including Stargate, which is called Project Camellia right now, for Effingham County. So this is a direct link. This is a data center that is being built out, is in the process of being built out, is online to a certain extent, but is in the process of kind of moving through the steps to get full capacity. They are not at it yet, but the construction has been going on for quite a while. And because the construction has been going on, that's why the city of Abilene has been stressed from a number of workers coming into their community and using and taking up those rental properties and causing that increase in monthly rent. Um, what we can do about that is kind of think about these counterpoints. So I'm going to present this article. Hannah's going to present the counterpoints of what we can do as communities to prevent things like this happening. So Hannah, take it away.
So, with the case of Abilene, Texas, you've when you get into the article and you look at kind of the history of Abilene, they were already facing some level of housing scarcity prior to the data center development. And so that is one of those cases of, you know, understanding what that local housing stock looks like, what the actual cost of living and housing in your community is, and being able to try to plan for what really any sort of new large development, like a data center, any other industrial development, what those impacts would look like. Part of the issue here that they're talking about is that housing scarcity was then so heavily exacerbated by that job influx for to support the data center, which is really interesting because we hear from all of these different data centers developments across the countries, across America, really varying degree of job opportunity and also where that where those jobs actually would come from. So like would they likely be hiring local? What sort of like specialty or education or experience are they looking for those types of jobs? So one of the recommendations that we really make is having that requirement for transparent jobs reporting coming from the data center developers. So how many jobs, what type of jobs, um, what is the likelihood that the local community is able to support those jobs? And to some degree, that would have to be done, planned out in conjunction with the local government. Another is when we're talking about those promises that these developments can make is the investment in local housing authorities. If you're not familiar with what a housing authority is, it is a local public agency that provides affordable housing and housing assistance for low income families or aging populations. And then having that pre build out understanding of current housing stock. Again, Abilene was already struggling with this to some degree. So why not have a strong housing plan with up to date inventories, having a plan to invest in diverse housing? And again, if we're talking about promises, what does that promise to support that housing inventory actually look like? And we're talking about diverse housing stock. We're talking about more than just single family homes, more than just 5/1 apartments, something that can fit different income levels, different lifestyles, and are able to be like infill development within the more developed or urban parts of the city so that we can limit what that suburban sprawl actually looks like.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. And the next one we wanted to look at is actually in Fayetteville, Georgia. It's QTS, Quality Technology Services. They were recently found to have been using water during the construction from unmetered lines. This did not come out until residents reported low water pressure, and the company was subsequently billed 150, basically $150,000. This case actually is really interesting because, again, it's something that happened during the construction process. What we have found is that when there are not clear ordinances, when there are not good guidelines, construction moves forward at a pace, and this build out of data centers happens at a pace where there can be significant missteps that really do affect the local communities where they're being built. Um, Another one in Georgia, in Covington, Servofarm and VoltaGrid, excuse me, they were recently fined by the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, and they issued notices of violation as construction of on-site power generation had begun without the correct air permits. So again, this is all happening during construction. Construction concerns that we have, is what's actually going to be the impact of server farm and VoltaGrid in the long term, but in the short term, what are those construction impacts as well too? Hannah?
Yeah, data centers have been like one of the biggest conversations in the country, and we're seeing all of these different issues with there being, fines for some sort of operational issue, and it's, all over the place. And really, that comes down to a need to have really clear procedures and oversight that need to be like checked off before any sort of operations can start. So whether that's like a sign off from the local water authority before you start pulling water, and part of that issue also comes from a lack of state clarity and communication with local government. So there seems to have been a lot of reliance on our local governments to make all of these moves and be able to have all of the know-how and knowledge that they need to have to um, be able to have these outlines of clear procedures and have all of the oversight they need to do. But for a lot of our communities, not only in coastal Georgia, but in Georgia as a whole, we don't have like the capacity at the local government level to be able to know how to do all that or even be able to manage all of that. And so some sort of like state intervention and clearer communication and work with the local government is needed. And, lastly is a stronger enforcement, right? Like if they're going to be doing things that we're saying that they can't, the enforcement and the consequences for that might need to be greater than a fine. You talked about, Eric, earlier that money tends to not be like a really big need for these data centers to be rolled out. And so when we're giving them a fine of X amount of dollars, how impactful is that really to their overall operation? And how impactful is that really to them being able to pivot and change? So that stronger enforcement piece of what's actually going to happen if they don't meet their promises, if they break some sort of rule within the ordinance or some sort of state rule with EPD, what does that actually look like and what does that actually mean?
Great, great summary. I think the stronger enforcement is the thing that we will be as an organization working on next legislative session. A big one that was in the news recently, Alliance Cloud Services LLC, which is a subsidiary of Hyperscale Data up in Michigan, had been fined for breaking newly adopted industrial noise ordinances. So it's really interesting. This hyperscale data center, it's actually for a hyperscale data center, kind of old. It's not the oldest out there, but it's been in operation for almost 3 years now. Because it's been in operation for 3 years, during that process, things happened where more noise was being created than was originally expected. That noise was so disruptive that local residents began asking their officials to get a law on the books. They did adopt a law that was an industrial noise ordinance law. This company was found to be not in compliance with that law, so they were fined. Um, Hyperscale has since promised investment in the area to fix the problem, expansion of the property with solutions to put in place. But I thought it would be important to highlight what their CEO, William Horn, said. And William Horn said, if they still aren't happy and feel that their home isn't enjoyable, then we'll buy their property for them. So it is not a consideration about the community that is around them. It is a consideration of how to make the problem go away without consideration for the community. And that's what that quote says to me. So again, this is a very complicated issue because the company is trying to work with the county, which is imposing laws, but residents themselves are trying to work with the county to get a get better laws in place and better ordinances in place so that their quality of life is maintained. And I think that that's really important. And Hannah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some things that these Michiganders can do.
Thanks, Eric. One of the really key parts of this, and we know that this is an older data center, so the knowledge of what local governments could ask for and communities could ask for, was a little bit limited at the beginning. But one of the really big things here is early intervention. So before a development becomes operational, and really even before any sort of build out begins, those requirements of better design facilities that have these acoustic barriers or requirements so that the development or the developer also knows what sort of decibels are going to be needed to follow and things like that. As early as intervention as possible is really what is going to make the biggest difference. If you you don't want people to be experiencing, noise issues for 2 years before there's any sort of solution that really isn't even going to be that strong of a solution because it wasn't actually engineered to be able to um, uh, like for the noise, it because it wasn't that early, uh, engineering wasn't part of that early facility, that you know they can put up all of these barriers and things like that, but it's would have been much more impactful if it was done from the beginning. And again, I know I'm going to sound redundant, but that's stronger enforcement and consequences. So if they are breaking these noise ordinance laws, what is the actual consequence for that? Is there some sort of stop in operation? Like, what is actually going to be impactful other than a monetary fine? So that's, some things we can learn from the Michiganders, as you said.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to highlight here that we are so this is such an emerging dynamic issue, and things are changing all the time, and new technologies are being promised, in some cases adopted. But what we know and what we've seen is that this infrastructure is getting built out and will be built out, and what is, as Hannah said, needed is this clarity and transparency about what that looks like, so that they can be held to the promise of what they say will be happening. Because this specific site did say that there wouldn't be a noise concern. In the article itself, it says that they did not expect the noise to reach as far away from the site as they thought. They didn't think it was going to reach as far and affect as many community residents as it is. That is should have been a known thing before any infrastructure was put in on site. So,
And
um,
Eric,
yeah,
I'll add to that, we've talked a lot about ordinances throughout this entire in issues investigation series. 100 Miles has a model ordinance that our coastal counties can look to try to determine what is important to include in their model ordinance or their data center ordinance. We wrote that in, gosh, maybe February, and even since then, we have learned so much that needs to be added to that ordinance so that it can continue to be the most up to date, the most accurate, the most useful, impactful, right? So it's still something that we're trying to continue to amend and edit to be the most helpful it can be. Because again, like this is a very evolving uh, industry that we're constantly learning new things about. So it's hard to be as prepared as you can be, but trying to use all the resources that you can to be able to do that's important.
yeah, for sure. Another case study that's really interesting and is kind of part of a broader issue in the placement of data centers is data centers are often being put in places that have limited amount of water. And so in Imperial Valley, California, this business called Imperial Valley Computer Manufacturing, tried to set up a data center. The original promise was that they were going to be closed loop system using local municipality wastewater that had been cleaned to wastewater facility, brought on site to use for cooling. That wastewater promise never happened. The local cities were like, we don't want you here. We're not going to provide you water. And so they refused. So the company is now suing for access to Colorado River water because they still want to build out. And the Colorado River is locally used for agricultural irrigation. And so they want their water that they believe they're owned for owning the land that the data center would be on. Um, It is really an interesting and complicated issue. We bring this one up mostly because we do, in the North Coast, especially in coastal Georgia, have water shortages. We do have this really interesting situation happening where most of the time, if data centers are using water in any way for cooling, their consumptive use is really, really high, meaning they are using that water and it is just going up into the sky a lot of times. So that water is lost. And so what we like to think about is water's best use, right? And so pulling from the Colorado River water in a water in an area that has water scarcity, is supposed to be used for agriculture, for growing food, and that would not be happening in this situation. So, very, very interesting article to check out. Hannah, I know you had some thoughts as well, so I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, Eric, I mean, you really touched on it, and we've, talked about it at nauseum in these past few webinars, but this is like a site and scale issue, right? Like, you know, why would we put something that would require so much water in a area that is as water stressed as Imperial Valley is in California? And, props to the local municipalities for saying you cannot, we do not want you to pull from the river. And, now it's put them in this hard situation. And this is, obviously like local governments can try to restrict that development to their best ability. But also, we're seeing a lot of data center development in these areas that are so water stressed. And it's just such a interesting situation that I just truly don't understand. Like, why are they getting themselves into this issue, basically? But, you covered it exactly. Like, it's a site issue, a siting issue. Like, why be here? Why be in these areas that can't support you with the resources that you say you need?
Hmm. Exactly. And I think the last thing we'll talk about before we go into some resources and some actionable things is nationally, a Bloomberg news analysis of electricity prices across the country revealed that because of the AI boom, because of this massive need for power, locations and prices across the US, if you are near a data center, that electricity now costs as much as 267% more for a single month than it did 5 years ago. And I think we put this in here because we know that data centers are growing. We know that it's a growing industry. We know that they're are power hungry. They need power. And because they need power, a lot of times they need new infrastructure because the existing infrastructure is enough. And much of the time, especially with public utilities, the people that pay for the infrastructure are the ratepayers. And because data centers have not been around long enough to be ratepayers, a lot of that build out happens um, from an individual rather than the companies. There have been many states, including Georgia, that have said that large load customers like data centers will pay their way. It is really important to remember that they may pay for their on-site rate, they aren't always paying for the infrastructure to get that power on site, and they definitely aren't paying for the build out of the power system, the creation of that power through new coal-fired power plants, through natural gas power plants, through sometimes alternative energy sources, bio, uh, those sort of build outs are happening now and happening throughout the country. And it's investment in what we've seen to a large part investment in fossil fuel energy creation, which is concerning to us, along with the increase in costs for ratepayers for that power. So a very complicated issue, something that we know there are ways to work around. So the point here, I think, and I can let Hannah chime in as well too, is that there are people working on this specific issue. This is expertise that 100 miles doesn't necessarily have when it comes to power grids, power transmission, power generation. But what we do know is that the analysis of areas that have data centers shows that those people around data centers are paying more per month in their electricity bill.
Yeah, Eric, for any sort of emerging industry that has really taken the country by storm at this level, some sort of national legislation or guidance from the federal government would be immensely helpful. Even, we've seen some states start adopting some sort of more stricter like permitting requirements for these new developments. And really, it's hard, right? Because if you're a local government and your citizens are feeling the effects of uh, some financial hardship with so many different things going on with the economic situation of the world right now. But when you get these promises of investment in education and more tax dollars that can be turned into real community benefit, that's really hard to turn down, right? And it's really something that you want to believe and be able to take advantage of. And that's why it's so hard for these local governments to try to um, really wade through all of the information and resources and everything that's out there. Um, Support from the federal government and support from the state government for these communities that don't have that capacity is huge. This should not be a burden for local governments to have to bear alone, right? And you've heard us say in this entire presentation, this is something that a local government could do to try to, stave off this issue or whatever. But, we're putting a lot of burden and expectations on some of these local governments that, again, just don't have that capacity. And so some sort of national support investment guidance would be huge at minimum at the state level. I mean, these are big issues that have really lasting impacts. And our communities need support for.
Yeah, sure. And I think that, draws us into what we've been kind of saying all along during this, which is that moratorium is sometimes what we believe to be the best tool. Pressing pause on data centers at the county level, at the state level, federally, would at least think of this as a way to, temporary suspend action, during a specific time period. What we always say is that that time period needs to be long enough to allow for research on what you as a community have that a data center might want and how you value those things and what a data center brings to the community. Um, Especially in coastal Georgia, we need to better understand data centers and AI and whether this development is going to continue or we are going to see data centers that, last for 2 years and then need to be decommissioned. And what does that look like? So figuring out what the information that is needed, allowing the community to engage and engage in the process with transparency, having open conversations, and then setting up those protections. So we've talked a lot about ordinances that ensure data centers are good neighbors. Ordinances can be restrictive in ways that prevent data center development where you as a community don't want them to be. And so I think it is really important to remember that the resources within your county or your community are your resources. As the public, your representatives should be able to represent your interests. And they are a kind of a extension of the community, right? Their job is to interface with this industry. And if they're not interfacing in the way that the community likes or appreciates, it is important to remember that they are elected officials. And that's how I will frame that. Um, a big resource which we have not talked much about, which I think is really important, and this is a hyperlink. I don't think I'm going to click on it now in the interest of having plenty of time for questions, but these will be available to you. You can click through here. All those dots represent data centers that either are proposed or the black dots are developed data centers. You can actually search this data center database through the map function and you can find out about if a data center is being proposed next to you, what that looks like, but also what that looks like maybe in another part of the country. And then you can search that area of the country of where that build out has happened and what issues they may have faced. This is a really good resource to figure out what's on the horizon for your community, but also a really good resource to figure out what other communities that have faced similar problems did, and how that process actually kind of worked out for them. The other one, which is another data center map, this has national as well too, but it also has the state of Georgia represented. It does cut the line off there. These are only for mostly for large data centers. So you can see that actually the Statesboro one is missing on this map. But this map is a really good tool. It does show the Effingham data center that's proposed on there. All the ones that are proposed are in green. Gray circles are ones that were proposed and then did not actually go through or did not get built out. And those gray dots are important to look at from the standpoint of why did that um, uh, build out fail and what was happening in that community that caused them to stop moving forward with the build out. The last thing I will say is that these maps, they are a great tool, but can be very overwhelming. And what we found as an organization, and what I found personally, is that if you dive into data centers, you will get overwhelmed very quickly. It can be very gloom and doom. It can be very disheartening. Um, I know we showed a bunch of articles about the bad things data centers were doing. And I'm not here to say that those aren't real things. What I am here to say is that actionable steps that need to be taken is that pressing pause, is that asking for a moratorium at your county meeting, asking your city to put a moratorium in place, working with groups to create and have a voice to inform those ordinances when they are adopted so that we do have ordinances in our coastal counties in Georgia that are addressing data centers because they are coming and they are going to get built out. And if we don't have something on the books, it is really important that we work to have laws and codes in place that allow for us to face this growing industry. Um, and I don't know if you want to add anything. It is a big problem. We know that there are lots of communities facing this, and what we want to always promise is our support at 100 miles. So we are a small team. We always say knowing one of us means being connected to all of us. And you know me and you know Hannah. This is my contact information. If you scan this QR code, it'll be give you a link to email me directly. Please do not hesitate to call or email or text if you have an issue that's arising in your community. We can connect you to resources and expertise and the model ordinance we talked about. We are very much invested in the idea of conserving the coast of Georgia and thinking about data centers as something that may fit in some places, but if you feel it doesn't fit in your community, then it doesn't, and we're here to help figure out how we can make that a reality. Um, the last thing I will say is that we have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm going to go off of this screen share though, so we can be in a broader, bigger screen to facilitate that. One right there. Okay, so what do data centers give back to communities that are economically stressed during the build out process? If residents can't afford rent because of a housing shortage and an influx of workers, is there any recourse for those communities? Hannah, do you want to jump at that one?
Yeah. So the answer is that they don't have to do anything. And so that's why we're really trying to stress, um, make them make these promises and then make them keep their promises, right? But, like I said, there could be like investment in their local housing authority. There could be, um, from the data center point of view, it's really interesting. From the local government point of view, it could also be okay, there is going to be this influx in tax dollars that these data centers promise. Like, how are you putting that to use to be able to support um, housing investment and housing affordability in your community? So it really comes down to what are they going to promise, and then how are you going to make them keep those promises? Did you have anything to add to that one, Eric?
Yeah, I think the big thing is like we've mentioned before, having clarity on how many workers are going to be coming into your area, then as a city or a municipality, you understand, oh, that's going to be massive, and we don't have the local workforce to handle that. So those are going to be people coming from outside and likely coming from 3 or 4 or 5 hours away or even longer or even farther. And if that's the case, then they have to stay overnight or they have to stay long term or they have to work a 10-day on, 10-day off shift. What does that look like for our local economy? So I think those sort of things are really important. When we think about it, I like the idea of it being phrased as economically stressed. An influx of people can be an economic stress if the infrastructure isn't there for the community to support them. You think about even from a grocery standpoint, if your grocery store doesn't have enough groceries to support all these new workers coming in, what does that do? What does that lead to? So I really do. I do think it's important to think about gaining that clarity. And those are things that are, for the most part, known or could be easily found out and should be part of that, you know, developer's process of being
Yeah.
transparent with what's going to happen to the community. Yeah.
Being armed with as much information as possible about, what that actual build out the is going to look like and how it will impact these communities, and also these communities being really realistic about what they have now, right? Like, so being able to identify, Eric, like you're saying, that there might be some gaps in that infrastructure that is already an issue, and trying to plan and expect for how that those could be exacerbated or anything like that. So
And another question that came through that's in a similar vein is it required for a data center developer to say how much water they are going to be using on site before their build out process begins? And I actually think that that's a really interesting question because what we know is that sometimes they don't know. Um, and so depending on what technology they end up using from cooling, the water requirements for a large data center might be really small. It might be extremely large. And so I think there is a possibility that they could provide an answer that ends up not being true. Um, I don't think, I think a big part of what we have seen is that clear plans on what the development looks like are hard to pin down because many of the times the development of the site is happening in stages and over a multi-year process. Um, maybe 3 or 4 years. Because this is such an emerging industry and technologies, by the time they reach year 4, data center 1 might have completely different technology in it than data center 4, because many of them are built out in buildings that are kind of modular units on the same site. And that would could possibly lead to a situation where um, the technology in one data center that's on the same site is different from the one in another one, and that could be vastly different in resource consumption. Um, I know that's a very confusing way to answer that question.
I'll just add that, yes, often the development itself doesn't really know how much water they're going to need. And when they don't know that, they also don't know where they're going to get that water from. So if that is going to be a groundwater withdrawal, if that is going to be surface water withdrawal, what that actually looks like, where they're going to get it, how much it is. So it gets really complicated and messy when you're trying to plan for that and when you're given, partial information because that might be all the information that's available.
Exactly. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I'm springing this on you, Hannah, but because questions have been a little bit few and far between today, what I would love to do was if you would share something that you learned during this issue investigation process that stood out to you as a takeaway. You could share, and then I'll share. I can go first if you'd like.
No, I can share. Like I said, there were so many things during this process that I've been wanting to add to our model ordinance. One of them was, gosh, I am going to mess it up, but different types of like sound readings, so different types of like decibel readings and different, to try to understand all of the different types of like sound pollution that and like noise that can affect the people who live around it. So I did not know that there was a whole other side of, noise measurement that is not just, the typical noise that we hear. So that was really interesting. And then the other one is, going back to that very first issues investigation that we did. Some of some of these is just like astronomical. Like you could not even conceptualize how big they are. And I think in that one, like I compare it to how many Brunswick Buckies or how many, super Walmarts. And like that, the scale was really interesting to me. And, that's how we get back into that site and scale conversation of where can they be and then how big is that footprint, and that footprint is somewhat correlated to that energy demand and that water demand. So that has been really interesting, really digging into all of these. What was yours, Eric?
Mine was very much about that scale. The scale is mind-boggling. So currently in the United States, there is only one operating data center that's more than a gigawatt. That is in Shelby, Tennessee, I believe. It's associated with XAI, and it's, I think, part of the Colossus project. That's Colossus 2. Colossus 2 is the only gigawatt uh, currently operating. The idea of hyperscale starts much lower, right? And was kind of thought of topping out at like a gigawatt or close to a gigawatt. Now we're seeing 6, 7, 10, 12 gigawatts being proposed as these data centers, these massive, massive campuses. Um, I I think it's the idea of scale is hard for people to conceptualize. And so I think, going back to that first one, these are on the size of multiple, multiple large big box stores on the size and scale of sometimes the power consumption of large are mid-sized cities. They are massive and they are resource hungry. And I think that scale, I just cannot reinforce enough how much bigger they are than you think that they are, and how much bigger they are proposed to be. So the plans are just planning for larger and larger and larger. Um, yeah. And on a positive note, right, Anna? They're just getting
Yeah.
bigger. No, so what I think that what that does bring about though, and what we have seen is that when we have these large load customers out there that are requiring a lot of energy, the stepping in happens more often, and even places like Texas that have a very pro data center lean, they are requiring now data centers to basically engage with the public utility to say how much power they're going to need. And they're basically on a pause right now before they figure out how to make that power available. So there's a slowdown happening in Texas right now around data centers, which is crazy to think about since it's one of the largest markets for data centers in the US. Um, I want to again plug the full series, so go back and watch those if you haven't yet. Feel free to reach out and ask questions. If you don't want to do them online here, again, my email is available. Do reach out and be expecting from us a follow-up email with this recording, with the resource in our slide deck, and any other things that has popped up throughout that we might be able to share out to help you in your communities when it comes to data centers in coastal Georgia. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And a big thanks to Hannah from me. And we appreciate you all. Without further ado, I'm going to say goodbye and have a good rest of your afternoon.